What if the weapons fueling the next global conflict aren't tanks or missiles, but trade embargoes and financial blacklists? Economic sanctions, hailed as tools of diplomacy, could inadvertently be the sparks that ignite World War III. Let's unravel the hidden dangers of sanctions, their unintended consequences, and how they might be steering the world toward escalation. Chapter 1. The power play of economic sanctions. Sanctions are often branded as the civilized alternative to war, a way to pressure nations without firing a shot. They freeze assets, cut off trade, and isolate economies. But here's the twist. They also push the sanctioned countries into desperation. When survival is at stake, diplomacy fades, and retaliation brews. From freezing Russian oligarchs' assets to blacklisting North Korea from international banking systems, sanctions aim to choke economies into submission. But history has shown us a pattern. Instead of compliance, sanctions often provoke defiance. Chapter 2. Retaliation. The boomerang effect. Sanctions don't just affect their targets. They ripple outward, disrupting global trade and alliances. The sanctioned nations aren't sitting ducks. They retaliate, weaponizing their own resources. Case in point. Russia's stranglehold on Europe's energy supply during its standoff with NATO. Cut off Russian oil and gas, and suddenly Europe is scrambling for alternatives, facing energy shortages and skyrocketing prices. The sanctioning nations bear unexpected costs, and tensions escalate further. And it's not just energy. Sanctioned countries often form alliances of convenience, strengthening ties with other adversarial states. Think Russia and China's growing partnership, an unintended consequence of Western economic pressure. Chapter 3. Sanctions and the collapse of economies. When sanctions hit, economies crumble. But the consequences don't end there. A destabilized nation is a breeding ground for unrest, radicalization, and even war. Iraq in the 1990s is a prime example. Decades of sanctions crippled its economy, leading to widespread poverty and suffering. The result? A volatile region primed for future conflict. Today, as sanctions against nations like Iran and Venezuela intensify, the pattern is repeating. Desperate leaders often see war as a distraction or a unifying cause. Sanctions don't just destabilize, they create conditions where armed conflict becomes inevitable. Chapter 4. Weaponizing. Global trade. Sanctions turn the global marketplace into a battlefield. Nations weaponize trade, using imports and exports as leverage. This isn't just about embargoes, it's about controlling resources critical to the global economy. Consider semiconductors, the tiny chips powering everything from your smartphone to military drones. When sanctions target these industries, they disrupt supply chains, creating a global scramble for alternatives. In the chaos, alliances are tested, and tensions skyrocket. China, heavily reliant on semiconductors from the West, has been stockpiling resources while developing its own industries. The U.S. counters with export restrictions. The result? A tech race that feels eerily like an arms race, with economic consequences morphing into potential military ones. Chapter 5. Financial warfare and the dollar's role. The global financial system, dominated by the US dollar, has become another front for economic warfare. Sanctions often involve cutting nations off from SWIFT, the system enabling international bank transactions. But here's the kicker. Nations shut out of the system don't simply surrender. They build alternatives. Russia and China are developing parallel financial systems to reduce dependence on the dollar. Over time, this could undermine the West's economic dominance, reshaping global power dynamics. The more sanctions target financial institutions, the closer we come to a divided global economy, a dangerous precursor to geopolitical fragmentation. Chapter 6. Public perception and sanctions. Backlash. Sanctions aren't just about governments, they hit ordinary people the hardest. Empty shelves, soaring inflation, and job losses create anger and resentment among the population. Leaders of sanctioned nations often weaponize this discontent, blaming the enemy for their suffering. This isn't just economic pressure, it's psychological warfare. The sanctioned population becomes more likely to support their leaders in defiance, strengthening nationalistic sentiment and reducing the chances of a diplomatic resolution. Chapter 7. The Domino Effect. Sanctions and allies. When one country imposes sanctions, its allies often follow suit. But this unity isn't guaranteed. Diverging interests and economic dependencies create fractures in alliances. Take the US and Europe during the Russia-Ukraine war. While the US pushed for sweeping sanctions against Russia, Europe's reliance on Russian energy created hesitation. The cracks in alliance unity provide opportunities for adversarial nations to exploit, weakening collective resolve. Chapter 8. The road to escalation. Economic sanctions, intended as alternatives to war, often lead to the very conflicts they aim to prevent. Desperate nations, collapsing economies, and fractured alliances create the perfect storm for escalation. When sanctions backfire, the result isn't just economic hardship, it's geopolitical chaos. The sanctioned nations lash out, the sanctioning nations double down, and the world inches closer to open conflict. The hidden danger of sanctions. As the world leans on economic sanctions to address crises, the risks become glaringly clear. Sanctions don't just punish, they provoke, destabilize, and escalate. They're the fuse in a powder keg of global tensions, and when they backfire, the consequences are anything but contained. If sanctions are the weapons of diplomacy, who will stop them from becoming the triggers of war?